Beneath chandeliers blazing like captive stars, New York gathers at the Metropolitan Opera, where whispers cut sharper than diamonds. Into this gilded arena steps an exiled countess, a scandal clinging to her like frost. A cruel wager turns her into a gift for the city's most unyielding tycoon. One public claim can save her name or shatter his empire. A secret inked years ago in Vienna throbs under the music's thunder, and an impossible choice rises: duty or desire, pride or mercy. When masks slip, who dares speak the truth? Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from, and what captivates you most in period romances, the slow-burn glances, the ruthless society stakes, or the hard-won vows. New York City, 1883. The air shimmered with the illusion of splendor that only the Gilded Age could produce, where chandeliers burned like captured suns and carriages rolled through Fifth Avenue like the pulse of ambition itself. That evening, the newly opened Metropolitan Opera glittered brighter than any palace in Europe. Diamonds glowed on throats that spoke in whispers, silk rustled like secrets, and every glance was a transaction between vanity and power. Among the jeweled women and starched men stood Countess Augusta Lyle, a stranger to this world of American excess. She wore a gown of deep plum silk, its sheen subdued by the austerity of her bearing. The bodice clung to her with disciplined elegance, the lace at her collar framing a face too proud to plead and too weary to smile. Her hair, dark chestnut and smooth as polished mahogany, was drawn into a braided chignon that revealed the delicate slope of her neck. Only her eyes, grey with a glacial calm that concealed unspoken storms, betrayed the weight of exile. She had arrived in New York scarcely 3 months earlier, carrying nothing but her title, her father's name, and the stain of a scandal she had not deserved. In Vienna, she had risked her reputation to forge her father's dying signature, not for greed, but to release the funds that would save an orphanage from collapse. It was an act of mercy turned against her, branded a crime by men who profited from ruin. Now, she was a curiosity in a foreign ballroom, a fallen countess in borrowed splendor. Music thundered from the orchestra pit, Verdi grand and merciless, as gossip drifted through the gilded balconies. The opera was not on stage that night. It unfolded among the audience. 2 young financiers, flushed with arrogance and champagne, whispered a wager that traveled faster than melody. "Present her to Townsend," one said, smirking. "He collects broken things, railroads, companies, women's hearts. Let him have a countess for charity." Before Augusta could retreat into the anonymity of the shadows, the jest became spectacle. A servant, bribed and blushing, approached her with a card engraved in gilt. "You are invited to grace Mr. Everett Townsend's box, by unanimous request of the gentlemen present." Laughter rippled through the audience. It was elegant, poisonous laughter, the kind that wounded without leaving a visible mark. Augusta's spine straightened. The rustle of her skirts sounded like defiance. She would not shrink. Not again. She crossed the hall with the dignity of a queen entering her own trial. Everett Townsend rose as she entered his opera box. He was a man carved by discipline, tall, broad-shouldered, his black hair touched with iron grey, his jaw unyielding. His reputation was legend. A widower and the master of a steel empire that shaped half the city's rails, he was known for his restraint and his temper, both equally feared. Tonight he wore the severity of his power like a second coat. Yet as he looked upon Augusta, something flickered behind his pale blue eyes, recognition, perhaps, of a loneliness that mirrored his own. The murmurs below grew louder. Augusta stood still, the soft lamplight resting on her cheekbones, her chin slightly lifted. Every rule of survival she had learned in Europe whispered for her to bow, to apologize, to disappear. But pride is sometimes all a woman possesses. "They expect you to laugh," she said quietly, her accent lilting through the tension like a violin's last note. Everett's gaze did not waver. "Then let us disappoint them." He turned toward the crowded tiers of society's finest. and with the calm of a man used to command, took Augusta's gloved hand. "Countess Lyle," he said, his voice steady and deep, "if society must find its amusement in cruelty, let it be at my expense. May I have the honor of calling you my future wife?" A collective gasp rose from the balconies. The chandeliers seemed to tremble with it. The conductor hesitated before raising his baton again, and for a heartbeat, all of New York held its breath. Augusta's heart pounded like the timpani below, not from joy, but from disbelief. His words were not tender, they were a shield thrown before her in the arena of gossip. Yet beneath the shock, an unfamiliar heat stirred in her chest. Not gratitude, not love, but a recognition of honor in its rarest, most inconvenient form. "Sir," she murmured, her voice barely audible, "you do not know what you invite." "I know cruelty when I see it," Everett replied, "and I have no taste for being part of it." He led her from the opera box before the whispers could regroup. Cameras flashed, fans fluttered like startled birds. In the grand vestibule, as the doors opened onto the icy night, reporters surged forward, hungry for scandal. Everett's carriage awaited, a dark silhouette against the white marble steps. Without hesitation, he helped Augusta inside. The city roared beyond the glass as hooves struck the pavement and snow began to fall, silent and accusing. Inside the carriage, no words were spoken. The rhythmic creak of wheels filled the space between them. Augusta kept her gaze on the fogged window, her reflection faint beside the blur of gaslights. Everett sat opposite, his gloved hands resting on his cane, his profile severe, yet troubled. At last she spoke, her tone soft but edged with fire. "You have made yourself the subject of their laughter." He looked up. "Then we are even." Their eyes met. Two strangers bound by circumstance and pride, by wounds the world could not see. For a moment the noise of the city disappeared, and only the slow, deliberate sound of their breathing remained. When the carriage turned onto Gramercy Park, Augusta glanced at the street lamps flickering through the mist, and wondered whether this strange alliance was her punishment or her salvation. The snow thickened, the horses slowed, and the wheels carved their path through silence. Neither spoke again until the carriage stopped before the Townsend mansion, its windows dark, its grandeur stern as judgment itself. Everett stepped out first, offering his hand. The cold bit through her glove as she placed her palm in his, feeling the restrained strength of a man who lived by control. Inside, he would decide her fate. But as she crossed the threshold that would alter the course of both their lives, Augusta Lyle knew only this. The cruelty of the world had just met its match in a quiet act of unexpected mercy. The Townsend mansion loomed before her like a cathedral to discipline, framed by bare-limbed trees and wrapped in the hush of freshly fallen snow. The house on Gramercy Park bore the severity of its master, not ostentatious but imposing, not welcoming, but watchful. Its windows were high and shuttered, its wrought-iron gate locked without apology. As Augusta stepped beneath the arch of its carved stone entrance, the gas lamps flickered overhead, casting long shadows along the polished marble floor. Inside, warmth greeted her not with comfort, but with ceremony. A single fire burned low in the grand parlor, and the scent of beeswax and old paper clung to the air. Servants moved through the corridors with the silence of ghosts, alert, efficient, and intentionally invisible. No one looked her in the eye. No one bowed. They acknowledged her presence only by vanishing into other rooms. Augusta did not flinch. Her boots made no sound on the Persian rug that stretched the length of the foyer. Her gloved hands remained still at her sides. She had been raised in colder houses than this. She had walked through courts where a woman could be destroyed by the tilt of a fan or the pause of applause. The house was silent, yes, but she recognized the silence. It was the kind that watched, that judged, that waited to see if she would break. Everett led her through the hall with a quiet, measured pace. He did not speak, nor offer a tour. He simply stopped before a heavy oak door, and opened it with a key from his coat pocket. "This will be your sitting room," he said, his voice low but formal. "Your bedchamber adjoins through there. You may arrange them as you like. My late wife's rooms were in the south wing. These have not been used for some time." Augusta nodded once, neither grateful nor offended. "Thank you." He paused. "Do you require a lady's maid?" "No. I prefer to attend to my own things." That, for a brief second, seemed to surprise him. His gaze flickered, just slightly, before returning to its usual granite reserve. He inclined his head, a gesture that held more respect than warmth. "You'll find the household orderly," he said. "Meals are taken promptly. Breakfast is informal. I take supper at 8. If you wish to dine separately, arrangements can be made." "I do not." Her tone was neutral, but final. "We are to present a household. It should begin at our own table." His expression did not shift, but his silence deepened. At last, he nodded again and left her without further word. Once alone, Augusta took stock of the room. The walls were papered in faded blue damask. The furniture was elegant but austere, a narrow writing desk near the window, 2 rosewood chairs with needlepoint seats, and a settee upholstered in pale grey. On the mantel stood a marble clock that ticked with mechanical insistence, as if marking time not in seconds, but in expectations. She removed her gloves slowly, fingers stiff from the cold and tension, then turned to the adjacent bedchamber. It, too, was untouched. The linens were crisp but faintly scented with lavender long past bloom. A wardrobe stood open, empty save for a single shawl folded with precision and hung on a silver hook. No hint of Everett's presence touched these rooms. No masculine scent, no discarded book or forgotten cufflink. It was clear these spaces had been prepared, not shared. Augusta did not cry. She had long since ceased wasting tears on what could not be altered. Instead, she unpacked the few things she had: a comb, a silver crucifix, a well-worn volume of Goethe's Wilhelm Meister, and 2 letters she never reread. When she placed the book on the desk, she noticed a stack of heavy paper and a sealed ink bottle waiting beside it. That, more than any welcome, unsettled her. She descended the staircase at precisely 7:58. The dining room was grand but not ostentatious. The walls were panelled in walnut, the chandelier a cascade of glass droplets that caught the firelight with subtle brilliance. The table, long enough to seat 18, had been laid for 3. At its centre, Everett sat already in place, his posture straight, his eyes unreadable. To his right at the far end sat a child. Lila Townsend was no ordinary girl. She sat with a stillness far beyond her years, her posture perfect, her gaze downward, not in shyness but in practiced detachment. Her auburn hair had been braided tightly, tied with navy ribbon. Her pale hands rested flat beside her plate. She did not speak. "Good evening," Augusta said gently, looking not at Everett but at the girl. Lila said nothing. Everett nodded toward the chair to his left. Augusta sat. Dinner was served without ceremony. A silent butler, tall, anxious, poured soup into shallow porcelain bowls. His hand trembled slightly, and he spilled a drop upon the pristine cloth. His face paled. Augusta, with quiet poise, reached for her napkin and dabbed the cloth without comment. "Thank you," she said to the servant, meeting his eyes. It was such a small gesture, but it shifted the air. The butler hesitated, then bowed, and withdrew. Everett's glance met hers across the flickering candlelight. No words passed between them. But something imperceptible had changed, some calculation, some preconception. He saw not a helpless countess in need of saving, but a woman who understood power in its quietest form. Throughout the meal, Lila did not speak. She picked at her food mechanically, her small shoulders tense, her eyes never rising. Augusta longed to reach her, not with questions, not with pressure, but with presence. She allowed silence to fill the spaces, not as punishment, but as permission. After dessert, a simple stewed pear, Everett rose. "You will find the household ledgers in the library if you wish to acquaint yourself with the domestic matters," he said. "Miss Harrow, the housekeeper, will brief you on the staff. You may choose your level of involvement. I will begin tomorrow." He paused, then added, "One more thing, Countess." She stood as well. Their eyes met fully for the first time that evening. "Our arrangement, as agreed, remains unchanged," he said. "We are married in name and for the sake of order. I expect discretion. You are free to manage the household and social affairs as you see fit. My business and my past remain my own." "Understood," she replied softly. "And mine?" He studied her. "Also your own." She gave the faintest smile, one that did not reach her eyes. "Then we are well matched." He inclined his head again, as if acknowledging a well-played move in a quiet game. Then he left the room. Augusta turned to Lila, who remained at the table staring at her untouched glass of milk. "May I sit with you a moment?" Augusta asked. Lila did not answer. So Augusta sat anyway, not too close. She folded her hands and waited. For 5 minutes, they sat in silence. For 5 minutes, no one moved. When Lila finally rose and left the room without a word, Augusta remained behind. She looked around the dining room, the polished wood, the silver, the reflection of fire in the dark glass windows, and felt the weight of a house that had forgotten how to breathe. But she had not. She had lived through colder rooms than these. She had survived the collapse of her name, the loss of her country, the sting of shame. She had crossed oceans with nothing but dignity stitched into the hem of her gown. And if she could survive all that, she would survive this. Upstairs in her cold bedchamber, she sat at the desk and wrote one sentence in careful, steady ink. "The silence in this house is not empty. It is filled with things unsaid." Then she blew out the candle, removed her earrings, and lay down to sleep. Alone in a bed that did not belong to her, under a roof that barely acknowledged her, but with a heart that still refused to surrender. The mansion revealed itself slowly, like a somber novel written in shadows and polished wood. Each corridor, each threshold, seemed to hold a memory sealed behind closed doors. Augusta moved through it, not as a guest nor a mistress, but as a careful observer, cataloguing every silence, every untouched corner. Days had passed in a rhythm more rigid than restful, each hour marked by routines that carried more weight than warmth. She had come to understand that this was not simply Everett Townsend's house. It was his fortress, a place built not to welcome, but to endure. On the morning that snow fell quietly upon the garden's iron gate, Augusta wandered beyond the familiar wing of her chambers. The housekeeper had mentioned nothing of the northern rooms, and no servant passed that way. Drawn by instinct more than purpose, Augusta moved down a narrow hall lined with portraits, half shrouded in linen. The windows here were tall but curtained, the air colder, tinged with forgotten perfume and the faint must of time. She opened a door onto a small sitting room, unused but not abandoned. A faint film of dust covered the mahogany surfaces, yet the fire grate had once been cleaned with devotion. Against the far wall stood a pianoforte draped in a faded muslin cloth. Beside it, a cabinet, its glass panes, fogged by age, remained locked. Above it hung a painting, veiled in heavy canvas, nailed at the corners. Augusta hesitated only a moment before pulling the cloth away. The portrait beneath it was of a woman in ivory satin, seated beside a harp. Her expression was soft, reserved, her eyes a familiar shade of pale blue that struck Augusta with quiet force. The brushwork was meticulous. The artist had captured not only beauty, but stillness. It was the stillness of someone who had smiled out of duty, someone who had known how to vanish behind decorum. It was Everett's late wife. She did not know how long she stood there. The fire in the hearth was cold, but a weight had settled over the room, as if the air remembered how to grieve. Augusta stepped back and turned toward the cabinet. Its key was nowhere in sight, but a crack in the glass allowed her a glimpse of the contents. Carefully arranged stacks of sheet music, bound in faded ribbons. One corner had curled from moisture, revealing the title handwritten in ink barely faded with time. Lila's Lullaby. A breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer, reading the notes through the fogged glass. The melody line was delicate, almost hesitant. Beneath it, notations in a woman's hand suggested gentleness, warmth. Phrases such as soft pedal and crescendo only at the third verse. She was still studying the composition when a whisper of movement behind her made her turn. Lila stood in the doorway. The child's eyes were wide, not with fear, but with something harder to name. Possessiveness, perhaps, or sorrow. Her arms were crossed, her shoulders rigid. She looked at Augusta not as a child looks at a stranger, but as a sentinel guards a buried relic. "I didn't touch anything," Augusta said softly. "I was only reading." Lila said nothing. Augusta walked slowly toward the pianoforte and rested one gloved hand on the cloth that covered it. "Would you like to play with me?" The child's brow furrowed. "It's not tuned. Then we shall play carefully." Still, Lila remained silent. Augusta sat on the bench, lifted the cloth, and uncovered the keys. Dust powdered her fingers as she pressed one. The note sang, a little flat, but clear enough. She placed her hands on the lower register and began a simple waltz, one from her Viennese girlhood. She kept the rhythm soft, unthreatening, never looking away from the keys. After a moment, she felt it. Not a sound, but a presence. A shifting weight beside her. Lila had sat beside her on the bench. The child did not speak. She merely lifted her hands and joined in, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. Augusta allowed the tempo to follow Lila's pace, adjusting with practiced grace. The melody they created together was uneven, imperfect, but it filled the room like a held breath finally released. At the doorway, unseen, Everett stood in silence. He had come in search of a misplaced document, only to be drawn by the unfamiliar sound of music, a sound that had not touched that room since before the portrait had been covered, before the cabinet had been locked. And there, beneath the morning light softened by frost, he saw two figures at the pianoforte. His daughter, who had refused to play for over a year, and the woman who had entered his house with nothing but scandal and silence. He did not move. He did not speak. But something within him stirred uncomfortably, an ache of memory, a wound reopening not with pain, but with possibility. That evening, Augusta attended a charity committee meeting at the home of Mrs. Harlan, a society matron whose drawing room overflowed with lace and lilies. The cause was unremarkable, hats for widows, blankets for factory children, but Augusta's presence made it newsworthy. Her appearance drew glances, veiled behind smiles. She was an object of fascination, of subtle condemnation. It was there she saw Whitney Beaufort. He stood apart from the older men, leaning against a column with the languid ease of someone born to money and too clever for his own good. His hair was golden, his mouth too quick with compliments, and his gaze far too interested in hers. "Countess Lyle," he said, stepping forward, "I must confess I never expected to see you in New York, or more to the point, married." She offered the faintest of smiles. "And I never expected to see you out of uniform. You were still a student last I saw you. Vienna seems a lifetime ago, doesn't it?" His voice was casual, but his eyes were sharp. "I was quite fond of your father's lectures, a brilliant mind, if somewhat idealistic." Augusta said nothing. "You caused quite the scandal back then," Beaufort added with a chuckle. "Though, of course, I never believed half of it." "How kind," she replied, her tone like porcelain, "and yet you seem to have remembered it all." He tilted his head. "Some names are difficult to forget." Augusta inclined hers in return. "As are some intentions." The moment stretched, filled with unspoken things. That night in her chamber, Augusta pulled a sheet of stationery from her desk drawer. She dipped her pen in ink and began a letter, the words deliberate, her hand steady. "My dearest Franz, I fear the ghosts I left behind in Vienna have found me again, clothed in new names, but with familiar eyes. I require your discretion and your memory. There is a man here, Whitney Beaufort. He claims to have studied under my father, and I believe he has reason to inquire beyond civility. If you can recall any connection between his family and those involved in the dissolution of my father's estate, I ask that you share it in confidence." She sealed the envelope and pressed it with wax. Outside her window, the city glowed like a crown dipped in soot. The snow had stopped, but the cold had deepened. She placed the letter beside her gloves and turned down the lamp. There was a knock at the door. Soft, respectful. "Come in," she said. It was Lila. In her hands she held a yellowed page, folded carefully. "I found this," she whispered. "It's from the cabinet. I used to listen to her play it." She offered the sheet to Augusta, who unfolded it with trembling hands. It was Lila's lullaby. Augusta's voice caught. "Would you like us to play it together?" Lila nodded, and for the first time her eyes did not look away. Augusta took the child's hand in hers, and the warmth between their fingers held something deeper than music. It held the first echo of trust. Snow fell with a quiet insistence, blanketing Gramercy Park in a white stillness that muffled the world beyond its wrought iron fences. The city, so often fierce with carriages and commerce, seemed to pause under winter's lace veil. Yet within the Townsend mansion, a different kind of preparation stirred, a soft frenzy cloaked in calm voices and the rustle of fabric, silver polished to mirror sheen, and notes of music echoing faintly down polished hallways. In the drawing room, Augusta stood by the hearth, adjusting the placement of a floral arrangement, simple, dignified white roses mingled with sprigs of holly. She wore a gown of deep hunter-green silk, high-collared with a delicate ivory lace yoke that brushed the line of her collarbone. Her hair was pinned in a braided crown, elegant but unfussy, in keeping with her own sense of propriety. Tonight she was not just a hostess. She was a figure of intent. The musicale had been her idea, a gathering of quiet significance, modest in size but rich in purpose. The city was thick with recent immigration, and cold streets swelled with new families who bore no names the salons recognized. Augusta had proposed a fundraiser for their benefit, offering music and tea in place of opulence. Everett had raised one eyebrow but said nothing, only granting her use of the main drawing room and the staff she required. The guest list was curated with care. There were reformers from the Ladies' Benevolent Society, 2 newspaper columnists, 3 wives of railroad men who owed Everett reluctant gratitude, and a handful of musicians Augusta had once heard at a recital in Vienna. Skeptics, allies, opportunists. The room would hold them all. She knew the language of appearances better than most. Let them speak of the event as a curiosity, and they would remember it as an awakening. The first guests arrived as the lamps were lit. Everett, standing near the windows with a glass of brandy untouched in his hand, observed the unfolding scene with his usual restraint. His dark coat blended with the shadows. His gaze, however, followed Augusta without apology. She moved through the gathering like one born to it, composed, attentive, graceful without effort. When she introduced a Polish violinist to a Methodist reverend's wife, she did so with the quiet authority of a woman who remembered what true civility meant. Her accent, more noticeable in moments of passion, now curled softly around each word like a thread of silk. Lila hovered at the edge of the room, dressed in a pale blue frock with a ribbon tied carefully at the back. She clutched a small book of sheet music to her chest, her expression uncertain but no longer withdrawn. Augusta noticed and crossed the room with a slow step. "Miss Townsend," she said gently, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, but soft enough to preserve dignity, "would you do me the honor of playing our guests a piece this evening?" Lila's eyes darted toward Everett, who said nothing, but his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Augusta knelt beside the girl, not in supplication, but in solidarity. "Only one piece," she murmured, placing a steady hand on Lila's gloved fingers. "You choose it, and I will turn the pages." For a moment the child's lower lip trembled. Then, with a breath drawn like a leap into icy water, Lila nodded. A hush fell over the room as the child approached the pianoforte. Augusta accompanied her, holding the music and placing it gently on the stand. The candles flickered as Lila sat, back straight, hands poised above the ivory keys. She began to play. It was a piece by Schumann, familiar, melancholy, filled with delicate turns that hovered just above the edge of sadness. Augusta stood beside her, fingers following the lines of the melody, ready to turn each page with a grace that did not interrupt the fragile magic unfolding. When the last note lingered and faded, the room exhaled. Polite applause followed, restrained but real. Lila turned to look at Augusta, and in her eyes shone something tentative and new, pride. Everett's gaze had not left them. A fire burned low in the hearth beside him, but it was not what warmed the room. As the evening continued, laughter began to replace formality. Guests lingered longer in conversation. One of the musicians played a Hungarian folk melody on the violin, and a glass was spilled not from carelessness, but from enthusiasm. In a quiet corner near the sideboard, Augusta accepted a glass of tea from a footman. Her fingers brushed the porcelain, then paused. A folded note had been placed beneath the saucer. No name, no seal, just plain ivory paper, creased twice. She slipped it into her palm without drawing attention and walked calmly to the side hallway outside the drawing room. Alone, she unfolded the note beneath the gaslight. "You've charmed them, Countess, but masks only last so long. You remember how Vienna ended. Convince your husband to grant the North River contract, or your name will be torn again, this time beyond repair." Augusta's breath did not catch. Her hands did not tremble. But the silence around her deepened, pressing against her ribs like cold stone. She folded the letter once, then again. Her feet carried her to the library, where the fire had been allowed to dwindle to embers. With calm purpose, she knelt before the hearth and fed the note to the flames. The paper curled and blackened, the words vanished into ash. "You will not break me again," she whispered. She remained kneeling, watching the fire consume what had once threatened to unravel her. She did not need to see the signature. She knew who had sent it. Whitney Beaufort had spoken with too much ease, too much calculation. He had not come to reminisce. He had come to assess her silence, to weigh how much her past might cost her now. The game was beginning, and this time Augusta would not play it alone. A knock at the doorframe startled her. Everett stood there, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the fire, then back at her. "The musicale is ending," he said. "They're beginning to leave. I'll join them shortly." He didn't move. "Your daughter played beautifully," she added, rising. "She hasn't touched a piano since." He stopped. "You reached her. She reached me." For a moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled behind her. The air between them held something brittle, intimate and vast. "She'll remember tonight," he said. "So will I." He nodded slowly. Then, in a voice far quieter, added, "Thank you. Not for the event. Not for the performance. For something more difficult to name." She inclined her head. "Good night, Mr. Townsend." He stepped aside to let her pass, and as she brushed by him, her sleeve barely grazed his coat, a simple contact. But in that second, the silence of the house changed shape. It no longer loomed. It listened. In her room that night, Augusta stood before the mirror, removing the pins from her hair one by one. Outside, the snow continued to fall. She watched it from behind glass, wondering not whether the past would come for her, but when, and whether this time she would be ready to meet it standing. The snow had turned to ice, clinging to the edges of the wrought-iron gate and crusting the garden path like a warning. The wind howled between the eaves of the Townsend mansion, carrying with it the whispers of a city that devoured reputations like bread at a starving table. Within the walls of Gramercy Park, the storm outside was matched only by the one rising quietly in the drawing rooms, parlours and offices where names were exchanged like currency and alliances formed in glances sharper than knives. Augusta knew the shift before it was spoken aloud. Servants paused when she entered a room. Invitations, once cautiously warm, began to chill. A subtle withdrawal from shopkeepers she had frequented. A mention of her name in the Morning Gazette, buried within the financial column, carefully worded but unmistakable. The Townsend household remains as enigmatic as ever. Whispers from Vienna cast long shadows across Fifth Avenue, but some fortunes prefer fog to clarity. She folded the paper slowly and set it beside her untouched tea. The china clinked slightly as she exhaled, the sound of porcelain struggling to remain whole. The library door opened with deliberation, and Everett stepped inside, closing it behind him. His expression was unreadable, as always, but there was a tension in his jaw that had not been present the night before. He remained standing a few feet from her, as if proximity might implicate him in something he had not yet named. "I received a letter this morning," he began, his voice low and controlled. "Anonymous, of course, accusing you of forging legal documents in Vienna, of using your marriage to infiltrate my business." She did not flinch. "Then whoever wrote it has a vivid imagination. There's talk in the banks, quiet but pointed." He crossed his arms. "That you came here under pretense, that your father's estate was not lost to illness, but to scandal." Augusta rose, each movement measured, her spine held by a pride that had survived worse than insinuation. She did not beg. She did not raise her voice. "My father was a scholar who died of heart failure after a lifetime of service to ideals this city has never understood," she said. "He trusted men with money. They betrayed him. I forged nothing. I authorized the release of funds intended for children who had no bread in winter." Everett's brows tightened. "That doesn't change the fact that you signed your father's name." "It changes everything," she replied. "Intent is not forgery, nor is compassion a crime." The silence between them thickened. Firelight flickered across the walls, casting long shadows onto the floor where neither dared step. "You married me knowing these rumors would follow," he said finally. "No, I married you because the alternative was disgrace. I remained because your daughter needed someone to remind her how to breathe, and because I do not fear ghosts, Mr. Townsend. I have lived with them." For the first time, his composure faltered. Not in his expression, but in the smallest shift of his shoulders. A breath drawn too slowly, a hesitation before speaking. But whatever words might have followed were shattered by a sound from the hallway. A cry. Small, sharp, and sudden. Augusta was the first to reach the staircase. Lila stood at the top landing, pale as candle wax, swaying slightly. Her eyes were wide, glassy with heat. She took one step forward, then another, her hands clutching the banister as though the wood were the only thing tethering her to the world. "Papa," she whispered, before her legs gave out. Augusta caught her before she struck the floor. She lifted the child in her arms and carried her down the corridor, barking to the footman for hot water and clean linens. Everett followed, stunned into silence as the rhythm of the house shattered around them. By the time the physician arrived, Lila's fever had surged. Her skin burned against Augusta's palm as she changed the girl's damp nightdress and bathed her forehead with cool cloths. The doctor muttered terms: infection, exposure, lungs tight. But Augusta heard only the urgency in his voice and the weight in his eyes when he looked at her. Not Everett. Hours passed. The lamps were dimmed. The house hushed as though in mourning, even before the danger had passed. Everett stood near the door, watching Augusta tend to the girl with a tenderness that required no audience. "Rest," he said at one point. "I will not leave her," Augusta replied. She remained at Lila's bedside, her hair loosened from its careful braids. Sleeves rolled past her elbows, whispering lullabies in a language the child did not speak, but somehow understood. One song, halting, mournful, threaded with hope. She returned to more than once. The same melody she had found in the locked cabinet, Lila's lullaby. At dawn, Augusta sat with the child nestled against her side, one hand resting on the girl's back, the other still holding a damp cloth. Her eyes had closed, heavy with exhaustion, but unwilling to surrender. That was how Everett found them. The pale winter light crept into the room, laying a faint silver glow upon the bedsheets. Lila breathed softly, no longer ragged, her fever beginning to break. Augusta, seated upright, her head tilted back, had fallen asleep without meaning to, her hands still protectively placed upon the child's side, as if warding off the world with her mere presence. He stood there for a long time. The man who had built a steel empire, who had buried his first wife with stoic restraint, who had mastered silence like a second language, now watched the woman he had once regarded as a necessary inconvenience tend to his daughter with a devotion no contract could compel. He left without a word. An hour later, Augusta awoke to the scent of something warm and unexpected. Breakfast. A tray rested on the table by the window. Tea, toast with jam, and soft eggs prepared the way Everett preferred them. A folded napkin, a linen handkerchief, and beside it a single slip of paper with his handwriting. "You did not need to stay, but you did. Thank you." She stared at the note, her hand lingering on the edge of the tray. No apology had been written. None was needed. The gesture itself, a man like Everett Townsend preparing, or at least requesting such a breakfast, was worth more than contrition. It was the first crack in the iron mask he wore, the first sign that something within him had begun to thaw, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, unyielding presence of a woman who had never asked for his trust, only offered her truth. Augusta sat beside Lila once more and reached for the spoon to stir her tea. The morning sun broke through the clouds at last, casting gold across the frost-lined windows. And for the first time since she had entered that house, Augusta Lyle allowed herself the smallest, most dangerous luxury: hope. The evening air was crisp with the scent of coal smoke and frost, the kind of night where even the gas lamps seemed to flicker with anticipation. Carriages lined the cobbled street outside the Union Club, wheels gleaming, footmen in dark coats brushing flecks of snow from velvet-trimmed cloaks. Inside, under carved ceilings and between mahogany-panelled walls, the power of New York stood polished and perfumed, railroad titans, banking heirs, wives with fortunes stitched into their hemlines. Among them stood Augusta Townsend. She wore a gown of black satin with a delicate panel of ivory lace at the bodice, high-necked, uncompromisingly elegant. A jet brooch rested at her throat, and her hair, gathered in a twisted chignon, gleamed beneath the chandeliers. On her arm, Everett, impeccably tailored in black, his cravat tied with military precision, escorted her with quiet gravity. The room stilled when they entered, not visibly, not rudely, but it stilled nonetheless. Some recognized her face from portraits in Austrian salons. Others remembered only rumors: the noble woman with a forged signature, the countess who had become a steel magnate's wife in one silent public claim. No one had quite known what to expect of her, but no one expected what they saw: grace, stillness, a kind of self-possession that neither explained nor apologized. Throughout dinner, Augusta spoke little, but when she did, her voice held weight. She asked about philanthropic efforts in the Lower East Side. She referenced a chamber music arrangement by Dvorak with such quiet insight that one banker's wife blinked in surprise and nodded, wordless, as if re-evaluating her entire seating chart. Everett remained by her side, his silence a wall and a mirror. Those who approached did so cautiously, their tones deferential. And those who dared whisper behind their gloved hands found themselves answered with glances swift and cutting from wives who had known power in more subtle forms. When dessert was cleared and the second brandy served, Augusta excused herself to retrieve her gloves from the retiring room. Everett waited near the fireplace, his hands folded behind his back, eyes fixed on the embers, as if measuring what could and could not be consumed. That was when Whitney Beaufort approached. "I admit," he said, swirling his glass, "I thought she'd fold under the scrutiny." Everett did not look at him. "Then you don't know her?" "Ah," Beaufort murmured, "but I remember her." Everett's eyes turned, cold as forged steel. "What you remember is irrelevant." Beaufort smiled thinly. "Everything is relevant in New York, Townsend, and nothing forgotten stays buried." Before Everett could reply, Augusta returned. She nodded politely to Beaufort, who bowed slightly, and then she placed her gloved hand gently on her husband's arm. The contact was light, but enough. "Shall we go home?" Everett did not hesitate. Yes. They left the Union Club with the same quiet dignity in which they had arrived, though the carriage that carried them back to Gramercy was colder than the one that had brought them. Neither spoke. Augusta's hand rested in her lap, still as snow on marble. Everett's gaze remained fixed on the city streets as they passed in shadow. When they arrived, the moment they stepped onto the stone steps, Augusta stopped. She smelled smoke. It was faint, but not the kind that came from hearths or winter chimneys. It was acrid, wrong. "Something's burning," she said sharply. Everett stepped past her, pushing open the front door before the butler could reach it. Inside, the scent was stronger. A footman ran down the corridor, panic widening his eyes. "The music room, sir, it's—" Everett didn't wait for the rest. He was down the hall in seconds, Augusta close behind. The door to the music room stood ajar, and beyond it, flames. The fire had taken hold of the curtains first, then climbed along the edge of the piano cover and caught the oil lamp left too near the sheet music stand. Now it raged across the eastern side of the room, devouring the upholstery, licking at the shelves. "Lila!" Augusta's voice rang out, sharp and immediate. "Where is she?" "Upstairs, madam," a maid cried. "But she went to fetch her music. She may—" Augusta did not wait. Ignoring Everett's command to stop, she ran into the smoke, her skirts clutched in one hand, the other shielding her mouth. The air burned her lungs as she pushed through the heat. She found the girl crouched near the cabinet, sobbing, the ends of her sash singed. "Come," Augusta said, lifting Lila into her arms. "Don't look back." The child clung to her, coughing, her small body shaking with heat and terror. Augusta turned, shielding Lila with her own frame as embers fell like fireflies around them. Her sleeve caught. She did not scream. Two footmen reached them at the threshold, Everett behind them, his face a mask of fury and fear. He took Lila from Augusta's arms, but not before seeing the blackened fabric of her gown, the angry red skin blistering beneath it. "Get her to the clinic," he ordered. "Now." Augusta swayed slightly, her breath shallow. "I didn't let go," she whispered. "I promised her I wouldn't let go." Everett touched her arm, then flinched as his hand found the burn. He looked at her then, not as an obligation, not as a stranger, but as something else entirely. Augusta closed her eyes as she was lifted into the waiting carriage. At the private clinic near Gramercy, the doctor worked in silence, removing the scorched fabric and bathing the wound. Augusta sat upright, teeth clenched, refusing opiates. Everett stood beside her, uncharacteristically still. When the doctor applied the final dressing, Augusta's hand reached blindly for the edge of the table, but instead found his. She froze. Everett did not release her. His fingers curled slowly, deliberately around hers, a silent vow in the quiet flicker of lamplight. Their eyes met. Not a single word passed between them, but something passed all the same. Later, as she lay on the clinic's narrow bed, her arm wrapped in gauze, Lila asleep in the adjoining room, Augusta turned her head to find Everett still seated beside her. He was no longer watching the firelight. He was watching her, and for the first time since she had stepped into his home, she saw a man without his armor, without the iron mask, without the fortress of silence. He did not speak. He did not need to, because in that moment, What was once cold steel had begun to bend, quietly, unmistakably, toward her. The scandal did not arrive quietly. It erupted. By dawn, every corner kiosk in Manhattan, from Wall Street to Washington Square, displayed the same headline beneath a lurid woodcut illustration of a woman with a veiled face, inked in strokes meant to resemble Augusta's own profile. The Countess of Forgery and the Steel King's Folly. Below, the article unfolded in breathless accusations. It spoke of fraud and deceit, of documents signed in shadowed parlors of Vienna, of noble fortunes ruined at the hand of a woman who used title and tragedy as her tools. It questioned the nature of her marriage to Everett Townsend. It hinted that the fire in their home had not been accidental, but part of a scheme to destroy records. Most damning of all, it printed copies of letters, unsigned but intimate, confessing to forged transactions and veiled blackmail. The handwriting matched the letter Augusta had burned in the hearth, but now it had returned, like a phantom cloaked in ink and hatred. Augusta sat in the library, the newspaper trembling faintly between her fingers. She read the article once, only once. She folded it slowly and placed it beside the lamp as though laying a body to rest. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the clock and the distant sound of Lila practicing scales on the pianoforte. Scales that would soon fall silent again. She already knew what would follow. She had seen it before. The slow, merciless unraveling of reputation, the cold hands of fear that would tighten around once generous hearts. And she was right. By noon, a telegram arrived. The Ladies' Benevolent Society had postponed indefinitely their collaboration on the immigrant shelter. By 2, Mrs. Langridge's coachman delivered a curt note expressing grave regret that Augusta's presence would no longer be welcome at the Sunday musical salon. By 5, 2 of the Townsend staff had requested transfer to the upper house on Madison Avenue. But the worst arrived with a knock on the drawing-room door. Lila entered, her cheeks pale and eyes rimmed red. "They said you tricked my father," she whispered, "that you married him to steal from him. The tutor's boys, they laughed when I said you taught me piano." Augusta knelt before her, every breath a deliberate act of control. "Do you believe them?" she asked gently. Lila hesitated, her voice small. "No." "Then that is enough for me," Augusta said. But it wasn't. Not truly. Not when the house itself seemed to hold its breath. That evening, Everett returned from his office with his face set in stone. His gloves were still in his hand, forgotten. His cravat was loosened, as if restraint no longer served him. He entered the library, closed the door behind him, and said nothing for a long time. Finally he asked, "Did you write those letters?" "No." His eyes searched hers. "Are you certain they're forgeries?" "They are lies," she replied, "but very carefully constructed ones. Whoever wrote them had access to the words I once used, phrases I once spoke. Someone has been watching for a long time." He paced to the window, stared out into the dark street beyond the glass. "The banks are uneasy. Investors have begun asking questions about the railway contracts. Your name has become mine." She stood, the fire casting amber light across her face. "Then let me resign from all charity work. I will withdraw. I will not drag your empire down." His voice broke through the quiet like flint against steel. "Is that what you think I fear?" "I think," she said, her voice low but unwavering, "that you're not used to being vulnerable, and I have made you so." He turned to her then, and in his expression she saw the man behind the reputation, wearied, furious, aching. "I will speak to Beaufort," he said at last. "If money is what he wants—" "No!" The word fell with weight. "If we buy truth," she said, stepping forward, "we lose it forever. He's ruthless." "So am I," she said. "But I am not corruptible." Everett studied her. Her eyes, clear, fierce, unflinching, were not those of a woman hiding guilt. They were the eyes of someone who had carried the burden of survival too long to allow herself to bow now. He ran a hand through his hair. a rare sign of uncertainty. "What do you propose?" "I will write to Franz Adler," she said. "He knew every detail of my father's holdings. He warned me of men like Beaufort years ago. If anyone can prove the letters are false, it is him." "You trust him?" "With my name," she replied, "because once he saved it. Perhaps he can do so again." Everett nodded once. It was not approval, it was permission, and in their fragile understanding, that was enough. That night Augusta sat at her desk beneath the soft glow of a single lamp. Outside, the wind clawed at the shutters. She dipped her pen in ink and wrote, not with fear, but with purpose. "Dearest Franz, as I feared, my past has arrived ahead of me. A man you once warned me about, Whitney Beaufort, is here in New York and has begun a campaign to unmake what little peace I've managed to build. He has forged letters. He has twisted my father's ruin into a weapon. I need you. If you still have the ledgers, the correspondence, anything that can prove my father's dealings were legal, that my signature was used only as a guardian to fulfill charitable debts, bring them. Bring the truth. But come carefully. Beaufort's reach is long. I would not have your name harmed in place of mine. Ever yours, in friendship and in faith, Augusta." She sealed the envelope with wax and pressed her ring into the still, soft surface. Then she sat back in her chair and stared into the fire, her arm still tender beneath the bandages, her breath steady. A knock at the door stirred her from thought. Everett stood there, not in formality but in shirt sleeves, no tie, no armor. "I'll have the carriage deliver your letter at first light," he said. "Thank you." He hesitated. "Do you want company?" She looked at him for a long moment. The firelight danced in his eyes. In his gaze there was no expectation, only an offer. "I would," she said softly. He crossed the room and sat beside her, not touching, not speaking, just presence. The kind of presence that anchors you when the world would prefer you adrift. They sat there until the fire burned low, until the clock struck midnight and the streets outside emptied of life, until Augusta leaned slightly, imperceptibly, into the warmth beside her, not from need, but from trust. It was the beginning of something not yet named, but it was real, and it was theirs. The wind that swept through Manhattan that morning carried the brittle scent of ash and frost. The kind of wind that scraped the skin with invisible fingers, that rustled the hedges outside Gramercy Park like whispers just beyond understanding. The city pulsed beneath its weight, unaware that within one townhouse, behind velvet drapes and polished brass locks, a reckoning had quietly arrived. Dr. Franz Adler stepped out of the hired carriage, his shoulders hunched against the wind, his hat low over his brow. He looked older than Augusta remembered. His coat, though woolen and clean, hung loose on him, and the briefcase he carried showed signs of wear. But his eyes, sharp and mournful, had not changed. They held the weight of things once witnessed and never forgotten. She greeted him not with formality, but with quiet urgency. They did not embrace. Instead, she led him into the drawing room where the fire had been lit and the doors firmly shut. "Is it true?" she asked, before they had even sat. Adler opened his case without a word. Inside were ledgers, faded telegrams, legal statements in German and English, and 3 notarized affidavits, one bearing the red seal of the Viennese Ministry of Commerce. "It began," he said, "with a bidding war." He laid out the documents like cards dealt by fate. "Your father's mine in Carinthia, rich in silver but operated at a loss for years, was suddenly of interest to a group of British investors. Your father refused to sell. Shortly after, the first accusations arose that he had falsified permits, that you had signed financial guarantees using his name. Within weeks, his holdings were frozen. The orphanage debt became public and scandal took root." Augusta's throat tightened. "Beaufort's father," Adler continued, "was among the interested buyers. And now his son is in New York, backing the same steel syndicate that tried to acquire the North River line from your husband's company. Do you see the pattern, Augusta?" She nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving the papers. "They dismantled my father's name to steal his land," she whispered, "and now they're doing the same to Everett." Adler said nothing. He didn't have to. Hours later, Everett stood at the head of the long table in the library, the evidence spread before him. Augusta remained at the far end, her hands clasped tightly before her. She did not move. She did not speak. He read every page. The silence in the room thickened until even the fire seemed to dim. When at last he looked up, his face was unreadable, but his hands trembled ever so slightly at his sides. "All this time," he said hoarsely, "it was him." Augusta stepped forward. "He used me to reach you. My disgrace was just rehearsal for yours." A long, painful breath escaped Everett's lips. He leaned on the edge of the table, shoulders heavy beneath the weight of betrayal. His jaw clenched, but there was no rage in him, only exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes when the walls one thought were stone turn out to be sand. "I've lost control of half the board," he muttered. "If I expose Beaufort now, I'll set the markets on fire. The syndicate will retaliate. The banks—" She cut in, her voice soft but resolute. "Then I will leave." He looked at her sharply. "I will write a statement," she said, already unfastening the clasp of her bracelet. "One admitting the letters were mine. I will take the fall. You'll be free of the association, and your investors will recover their faith." His eyes widened. "You can't mean that." "I do," she said, "because this was never your scandal. It was mine, long before you met me." He stepped closer. "That's not what this marriage is." Her lips quivered, but she stood her ground. "I am not your weakness." "No," he said, voice shaking. "You are the only strength I didn't know I needed." She turned from him. She could not bear it. His voice laced with emotion, the way he looked at her now as if seeing her truly for the first time. "You cannot afford to lose everything," she said. He moved to block her path. "And what if I can't afford to lose you?" She stared at him, breath caught. "I built my life on control," he said quietly, "on order and power and careful silence. And yet you—" He stopped, his voice rough. "You came into my house like winter, and instead of cold you brought fire. I didn't ask for it, but I cannot go back to what it was before you." The tears burned behind her eyes, but she did not let them fall. "Not yet. I've already packed," she said. "Then unpack," he answered. She tried to move past him. He reached out, just barely. His hand touched hers. She did not pull away. And there, in the foyer, with her valise waiting by the door, they stood in a silence so heavy it seemed the very walls listened. "I never expected to feel this," he said, "and I'm afraid of it. But I would rather face ruin at your side than safety without you." She dropped her gaze, trembling. "I don't know how to be someone's haven," she whispered. He lifted her chin gently. "You already are." And then, with no grand declaration, no audience, no ceremony, he pulled her into his arms. It was not a kiss. It was not passion. It was something deeper, a holding, a binding, a silent plea to remain. She folded into him, burying her face against his chest as he wrapped his arms around her with a desperation that betrayed everything his composed nature had once concealed. They stood there, two wounded souls clinging to something neither of them had expected to find in the other. Not rescue, not redemption, but home. And in that moment, in that hush between disaster and defiance, Augusta knew that she would not leave. Because for the first time since Vienna, someone had chosen her not despite the fire, but because of it. The morning air over the East River carried the scent of iron and fog, as if the city itself held its breath. Outside Townsend Ironworks, carriages lined the block, their wheels hissing against cobblestones dampened by last night's rain. Newsboys lingered near the gates, clutching stacks of early editions already stained with ink and scandal. Above them, from a third-story window, Augusta stood still in a navy walking dress trimmed with black velvet, her left arm still stiff beneath the silk. She watched Everett below, flanked by his board members and factory foremen, walking toward the makeshift dais set in the yard. He had refused a ballroom, refused the comfort of the club or the sanctuary of the press hall. If the truth was to be spoken, it would be spoken where thousands of his men had worked steel with fire and will. There would be no curtain, no orchestra to soften the blow. Inside the house, Lila perched on the library ottoman, clutching a shawl around her narrow shoulders. Her governess had been dismissed for the hour. Mrs. Braddock and the kitchen staff lingered in the hallway, pretending to polish brass that did not need polishing. In the courtyard, Everett removed his gloves and stepped forward. Cameras clicked, pens scratched. Beaufort's name had been on every column for 3 weeks. The pressure to stay silent, out of dignity, strategy, and fear, had nearly broken him. But Augusta had stood before him, eyes clear, voice calm, and said the one sentence that had broken through all hesitation: "If we buy truth, we lose it forever." He glanced once at the crowd. Then he spoke. "There has been enough smoke," he said, voice clear and unhurried, "and now it is time for light. No grand flourish, no written statement, just the man, his voice, and the weight of truth." He recounted the fire, the forged documents, the blackmail notes, and the Vienna scandal, all of it connected, all of it traced back to Whitney Beaufort's syndicate. He presented Dr. Adler's testimony, notarized and stamped, and a letter written in the same hand as the infamous threats, cross-checked by handwriting experts, made public. A murmur rippled through the audience. Then Everett paused, his eyes dark beneath the grey of a sleepless night. "My wife," he said, and it was the first time he used the title in such a setting, with such gravity, acted with honor. In Vienna, she risked her name to save children the world chose to forget. Here she has served this city's poorest with more courage than those who sit in velvet seats and pass judgment over canapes. He looked not at the reporters, but toward the workers standing along the gates. "She came to me as a stranger, and was offered mockery in place of welcome. She endured gossip with grace, and still she stood by this house, by my daughter, by me. Let any man who calls her criminal stand before me now and repeat it to my face." Silence, then a surge of motion. The flash of cameras, the rush of pens scratching faster. He did not wait for applause, though some hands began to clap. He turned, descended the dais, and returned to the carriage that would take him home. That evening, the city shifted. The New York Herald retracted its earlier claims. The World published a full spread under the headline, "The Woman Who Faced the Empire." Illustrators sketched her from memory and whispered rumors of her music, her grace under pressure, her decision to stay when any other woman would have fled. Letters from former guests of the musicale poured in with apologies and new offers of support. A baroness from Boston sent a telegram, a bishop pledged donation, but none of that mattered to Augusta. In the quiet parlor, beside a vase of lilies from Lila's bedroom, she sat near the piano, her gloved hands folded in her lap. The fire glowed low. Her bandaged arm rested gently against the armrest. She had not asked for vindication. She had prepared herself for silence, or shame, or the slow death of a reputation too far gone. Instead, she had been given something she no longer believed she deserved: justice. Footsteps padded softly on the carpet. Lila appeared in her nightdress, holding a folded paper in both hands. "I copied it," she whispered, "from memory, before the fire." She handed over the sheet, the melody Augusta had once read from the locked cabinet, now rewritten in a child's neat, effortful hand. At the top, in smudged pencil, the girl had written a new title, "Lila's Lullaby, for Mama Augusta." Augusta's breath caught. She looked up, lips parting, but no words came. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the sheet, and for a long moment they sat in silence, the fire crackling softly between them. Then she reached for Lila's hand, pressed a kiss to it, and held it to her cheek. Later that night, as snow dusted the windows in delicate, drifting patterns, Everett entered the drawing room. He did not wear his cravat. The tension that had carved itself into the lines of his face for months seemed lighter now. though his eyes still held the weight of a man who had fought wars no one else saw. He looked at the portrait above the mantelpiece, the shrouded frame that had once watched over the room like a ghost. Slowly he stepped to it, lifted the cloth, and removed it from its hooks. Augusta, seated by the fire, did not speak. She simply watched as he carried the portrait to the study across the hall, where the late wife's memory would be kept with dignity, but no longer given dominion. He returned moments later, hands empty. Their eyes met across the room. He did not bow. She did not rise. But something shifted between them, a solemn understanding forged not in passion, but in storms weathered side by side. "Will you stay?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Augusta nodded, her voice steady and quiet. "Yes, I will stay." The music room was gone. The house still bore smoke in the beams and ashes in the corners, but the silence that had once ruled it no longer held dominion. From above, the final notes of Lila's lullaby drifted down from the girl's room, played not for perfection, but for peace. And in the parlor below, Everett Townsend closed his eyes and listened, not to the scandal, nor the market, nor the noise of the world, but to the music of a home finding its voice again. Spring arrived in Manhattan like a whispered promise. It came first in the fragrance of hyacinths carried through the narrow lanes of Gramercy Park, then in the golden lace of morning sunlight that spilled across Augusta's writing desk, warming the ink bottle, softening the starched folds of the letter she never finished. The iron fences no longer looked like prison bars. The trees, once stripped by winter's cruelty, now blushed with blossom. The city awoke with purpose, and so did she. Augusta stood at the second-floor window of the townhouse, watching the park below with a calm that had once been unthinkable. The war was over, not just in the press, nor in the courts of public opinion, but in the quiet chambers of her own spirit. She no longer braced for whispers in the street or glances laced with suspicion. The neighbors had stopped crossing to the other side of the walk. Children waved at her carriage. A florist sent violets without a card. Inside the mansion, everything had changed, though nothing in truth had been rebuilt. The walls were still the same stone. The halls still echoed when one walked alone. But there was no longer a chill to the silence. Instead, the air carried the sound of Lila's hesitant scales on the piano, of Mrs. Braddock scolding the new footman for tracking in mud, of laughter. The music room, restored by Everett's order, now bore new wallpaper, new carpets, and in its corner a slender cabinet made by the factory's own artisans. Inside, it rested a single cherished item, the original handwritten copy of Lila's lullaby, now framed in brass. On the day of the renewal, the household rose earlier than usual. The ceremony would be private, no archbishop, no headlines. Only the truth would be witnessed. Lila, solemn as a church bell, wore a white ribbon in her hair and carried a small bouquet of lilacs. She insisted on composing a new arrangement of the lullaby for the occasion, to be played before the vow exchange. She had practiced it for weeks with Augusta's gentle guidance. Her fingers still stumbled over one difficult transition, but she played it with heart, not perfection, and in this house, that mattered more. Augusta chose not a bridal white, but a deep green silk gown embroidered with gold thread at the cuffs and collar. Her hair was swept up with ivory combs sent from Vienna by a former pupil of her late father. Her only jewelry was a brooch with Everett's family crest, gifted to her by Lila the week prior, with an innocent whispered confession, "He never gave this to Mama. I think he wanted to." Everett descended the staircase in a grey morning coat and pearl waistcoat, his shoes polished, his watch chain gleaming faintly under the foyer gaslight. When he saw Augusta at the bottom of the stairs, his breath caught, not from desire, not even from awe, but from recognition. She was no longer a stranger in his house. She was no longer a scandal in silk. She was the woman who had stayed when storms raged and silence tried to drown them both. She was the wife he had chosen. They stood before the hearth, where once they had exchanged cold words and cautious glances. This time, their hands touched without hesitation. The butler, Mr. Hawthorne, served as officiant by Everett's own design. He read a passage from a book Augusta herself had once translated, Goethe, worn with age, its pages fragile. Then he stepped back, allowing the couple to speak. Everett spoke first, voice quiet, steady. "You gave my life order." Augusta's fingers tightened around his. "You gave it purpose. No declarations beyond that, no grand speeches to echo through parlors or ballrooms, only truth, spoken softly between two people who had already lived every promise." Lila clapped once, then caught herself turning crimson. Augusta smiled and kissed her brow. Later they dined together. Not a feast, but a meal of favorites. Beef pie with claret sauce, roasted carrots with rosemary, warm lemon cake. Augusta had personally baked the bread that morning. Everett noticed the flour still under her thumbnail. He said nothing, but when she offered him the first slice, he accepted it with reverence. After the dishes were cleared and the daylight faded into the lavender hush of twilight, Lila took her place at the piano. She sat straighter now, unafraid of missed notes. Her feet reached the pedals. Her fingers touched ivory with confidence. As she began to play, Augusta settled on the settee with a book of poetry, her voice lilting as she read aloud, not to impress, but to soothe. Everett stood by the doorframe, leaning one shoulder against it, hands folded, gaze unguarded. He watched them, the girl and the woman, knowing this was the life he had not thought possible. No empire, no merger, no monument could compare. The music rose and fell like breath. He walked across the room without a word, sat beside Augusta, and simply listened. And though no clock marked the moment and no choir proclaimed it, something sacred passed between them. Not new love, nor sudden passion, but something older, deeper, something earned. Later that evening, as lamps were extinguished one by one, Augusta stood at the window of her writing room. The street below was bathed in amber glow. Gaslight shimmered on the wet pavement, and carriages passed like drifting shadows. She opened her journal, dated the page, April 15th, 1883, and wrote a single line. "Grace is not something we inherit. It is something we build, one kindness at a time." A knock at the door. Everett entered holding 2 cups of tea. No whiskey, no brandy. Only quiet warmth. They sat in the silence, side by side, without need for conversation. Outside, Gramercy Park slept under its canopy of new blossoms. The townhouse no longer echoed with grief or uncertainty. It breathed softly and fully, filled with life, with music, with second chances. And in that home, once ruled by silence, a countess who had come as a jest, and a man who had once armored himself with solitude, now stood side by side, not as symbols of scandal or strategy, but simply as husband and wife, the wife he chose. New York, autumn of 1889. The trees in Gramercy Park had turned to fire. Amber, rust and gold clung to every branch, and when the wind stirred, the leaves scattered across the iron railings like the last embers of a fading song. The city had grown louder, taller, more relentless, its skyline pricked now by steel skeletons promising the future. But inside the townhouse on Gramercy Park East, time still knew how to move gently. In the music room, the one once claimed by flames and silence, a young woman played with assurance. Her auburn hair was pinned neatly, her gloves removed, her back straight. She struck the final chord with care and glanced up. "I missed a note," Lila murmured. "You covered it beautifully," Augusta said, seated behind her. Her mending needle paused mid-stitch. Lila turned, now 16, composed and bright. "Papa will notice." "He always does," Augusta replied with a knowing smile. "But he also smiles now, even when he hears the mistakes." They both laughed. It had taken years, but the ghosts that once haunted the house had faded into framed memories. Portraits no longer hidden, a music cabinet now filled with original compositions. The portrait of Everett's first wife still hung in the study, but now beside it was another, Augusta's, painted by a Viennese artist who once owed his career to her father. The two women, one gone and one gloriously alive, watched over the home like echoes of different eras, no longer rivals in memory, but pages in the same book. Augusta rose, stepping slowly to the window, the weight of years softening her posture. Time had been kind to her spirit, if not always to her hands. The faint scars on her arm from the fire remained, a reminder of a choice made in instinct and love. She had worn them without shame. Below, carriages passed as ever, but the world beyond them had shifted. Women now attended lectures at Cooper Union. A new charity for widows of railroad workers bore her name, the Lyle Trust for Dignity. And in drawing rooms and industrial meetings alike, her presence was no longer tolerated. It was requested. Whitney Beaufort had not fled far enough. He was arrested in Buenos Aires in 1885, extradited and exposed in 3 countries for fraudulent schemes. His fall had been swift and merciless. He never spoke Augusta's name again, not even during his trial. Dr. Adler had passed 2 winters ago, his heart weakened by years of battle for justice. Augusta had sat with him in his final hours, whispering that truth, even when late, had saved more than one life. He had smiled faintly, murmured, "Für dich immer," and left the world in peace. And Everett, dear Everett, remained a man of steel, though no longer behind armor. He had transformed his empire not only in profit, but in principle. Child labor laws were quietly enforced in his factories. His workers received fairer wages than most in the state. It had cost him allies and invitations, but never sleep. That evening, when he entered the music room, he carried no papers, only a velvet box. Augusta raised an eyebrow. "What did you refuse to invest in this time?" He smiled, lines at his temples deepening. "Your birthday isn't until December, but I saw this and thought of you." Inside the box was a brooch, an exact replica of the one Lila had once given her, but now adorned with 3 tiny emeralds, one for each of them. "You gave my life order," Augusta whispered, eyes shining with memory. "And you gave it music," he answered. They embraced, not with urgency, but with the fullness of lives lived alongside one another. Theirs had not been a marriage of lightning, but of firewood and flint, built day by day through storms and silences. Outside, the wind stirred again. Lila returned to the piano, flipping to the final version of Lila's lullaby, the piece she had rewritten over the years. It no longer sounded like mourning. It was hopeful now, strong, tender. And just as the final notes floated into the room, Augusta reached for Everett's hand. They stood, side by side, in the room that had once burned, the air filled with music born from ashes. And in that moment, the past bowed before the present. Their story had begun as a cruel joke. It had become a vow, and now it was a legacy. The end. Every love story teaches us something, but some leave a mark deeper than others. The Wife He Chose is not just a tale of romance born from scandal. It is a story about second chances, quiet courage, and the kind of love that grows not in grand declarations, but in shared silences and hard-won trust. Augusta and Everett showed us that dignity can survive disgrace, that kindness can rewrite history, and that healing often begins with the simplest act of listening. If this story moved you, if you felt the hush of the music room, the firelight in Gramercy Park, the weight of a hand held in silence, tell us in the comments. What was your favorite moment? What stayed with you? And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word legacy in the comments. That one word will let us know you felt this story all the way in your heart and help us reach more people who love emotional, historical stories just like this one. If you'd like to support the small team that brings these stories to life, we humbly invite you to send a super thanks in whatever amount you feel moved to give. Your support helps us keep creating the kind of content that values emotion, history, and beauty. And if a contribution isn't possible right now, that's perfectly okay. You can still help by sharing this video with a friend or family member who might need a reminder that love can bloom, even from the unlikeliest of beginnings. More stories like this await you in the cards above. We hope you'll stay a while. Thank you for letting us tell you this story. We're honored you came this far.